So they're really the front door to culture. And most FTOs are unaware of that role that they're playing, that teaching that
Mhm.
anytime two people get in a room together, a culture is created.
And if we intervene as leaders to make those small course corrections when they happen, when we see them, we're going to be able to make sure the culture is moving constantly in the direction that we intend it to go.
In the work of leadership, there is no such thing as neutral, right?
Yep.
You are either contributing or you're detracting.
You're listening to the Elevate Your Call to Service podcast.
Here, law enforcement leaders gain practical tools to lead proactively in a reactive profession so they can communicate clearly, strengthen internal trust, and stay grounded in their call to serve.
I'm Mike McIntosh, a retired sheriff and current division chief with nearly 4 decades in law enforcement leadership.
And I'm Cathy McIntosh, a business and branding strategist and longtime law enforcement wife. I focus on the human side of leadership, communication, identity, and the internal dynamics that impact performance and trust across an organization.
Together, we combine real-world command experience with clear, actionable leadership conversations.
So you can lead with intention, build stronger teams, and elevate your call to service.
Well, welcome back to Elevate Your Call to Service podcast. We're really excited today. We're joined by my friend and our guest, Karen Collins Rice, is the co-founder of Heroes Active Bystandership Training and has spent more than 30 years helping organizations build stronger leaders and healthier cultures. She was the curriculum designer for Active Bystander for Law Enforcement, a project out of Georgetown University, and is the architect of Trust-Centered Leadership, a leadership development program focused on emotional intelligence, trust, communication, and organizational culture. Karen teaches executive leadership programs across the country, including the California Chiefs of Police Executive Leadership Program, the University of Virginia's National Crime Justice Command College, and the Metropolitan Police Department's DC Leadership Academy. She is also a fellow of the Future Policing Institute and serves as a subject matter expert for CNA's Center for Justice Research and Innovation. Karen brings a unique perspective on what it takes to prepare leaders, strengthen organizational culture, and build agencies that are equipped to adapt and thrive.
Karen, I think we could have spent the entire day reading your bio, but why don't you tell me how you and Mike got acquainted and how your paths crossed?
Thank you, Kathy. And first of all, thank you for having me. And every time I hear my bio, the first thing that pops in my head is, oh my gosh, I'm getting old. Oh, but Mike and I had the pleasure of working together. I think it's been a couple of years ago now with
Yeah.
California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. So that is the first organization that brought Heroes Active Bystandership training to corrections. So we and Mike, I can't remember. We did work together in Able as well. Is that right?
No, actually,
Okay, so
Heroes was the
it was
first
CDCR.
opportunity. Yeah.
Okay, right, yeah. So Able, Georgetown, made the decision to focus exclusively on law enforcement for active
Mhm.
bystandership. That was their original mission. So much of their philanthropic support came based on that audience, right? Bringing active bystandership to law enforcement. But Joel DeVoskin and I, and later Abigail Tucker, recognized that you know law enforcement or policing was not the only place within public safety where active bystandership could benefit.
Mhm.
So we broke off, created Heroes to bring that training to other places within public safety outside of patrol of law enforcement.
Mm.
So that's how Mike and I met, and we delivered. I cannot remember how many. We were there for the better part of a year, just helping train the trainers, train internal instructors with CDCR to deliver that curriculum within their organization.
which is awesome. You guys are doing an incredible work there. I know that it's much needed and it just keeps growing, which is fabulous.
Yeah.
I know that we've talked a lot about organizational culture on this podcast, and that's one of your heartbeats. Who in a police organization, who are the real teachers of that
Mhm.
organizational culture?
That is such a great question. And it's anyone in a leadership or supervisory role. And I think, and what's interesting about that, Kathy, is a lot of leaders don't really understand the ways in which they create culture, the
Mm,
ways in which they cultivate climate in the organization. So we often think, oh, the culture is dependent upon the chief, the person at the top. And while it's true that a chief by themselves can uh, kill a good culture, they cannot by themselves create a healthy culture. And so
mm,
what creating healthy culture and climate requires is the intention of the leadership collective in the organization, from FTOs, which are not positionally a supervisory position, but they absolutely carry leadership responsibility in their work of training and educating and developing new recruits, new members of the organization. So they're really the front door to culture. They're the ones who socialize new members into how things are done around here. And most FTOs are unaware of that role that they're playing, that teaching that they're doing. And there's a great saying with culture, like it's happening whether you intend it or not. So
Hmm.
anytime two people get in a room together, a culture is created, right? And it's simply just the accepted norms of behavior. And so most of the time when leaders and organizations are not intentional about those norms and those expectations, they happen, they get developed, and for the most part, they're not the ones you want. Right. So
mm,
unattended to culture just kind of goes off the rails, right? It happens in degrees. And that's why, a lot of times agencies will have something happen uh, that is anyone, any leader would agree is outside of what they expect to happen, what the values of the organization are, all that, how they wanted something to happen. And they say, how did we get here? How did this happen? So many times, like, how did this happen?
mhm.
And what we know is it happens incrementally. So, and it's those incremental shifts away from what you actually want to create that go unseen, that go unnoticed, that go, and even if they are noticed, they're just like, well, it's just, it's just like a small thing, right? Take the problem employee, for example,
Hmm.
right? Instead
Hmm.
of coaching, developing, giving feedback, setting expectations, holding accountable, leaders often will just shovel them off to someone else.
Mm,
Shift them off to that project, take them off to
Hmm.
that. Sometimes they put them in the role of FTO, right? That's
right.
just oh, that person didn't get promoted. So let's just move them over to FTO without realizing the broader impact on climate and culture that's occurring because leaders are not addressing the little thing, right? Culture is all about little things.
The interesting thing that I find about find with culture is I think those two words, intentionality, is so key because most of the time, I would tell you that growing up in law enforcement, that wasn't front of mind, right? That everything that we do is either supporting an intentional culture, or it could actually be going against the grain of the culture that the executive wants to set. And the other thing that I find interesting in the work that you and I did in California, and the work that Able and Heroes really does, is there's that intervention part.
Hmm.
And when I think about leadership intervention, it's that you talked about those small things or that going off the course. And if we intervene as leaders to make those small course corrections when they happen, when we see them, we're going to be able to make sure the culture is moving constantly in the direction that we intend it to go. But so many times, you're right. That problem employee,
Mhm.
we're trying to push it off to somebody else because
Yeah.
we don't want to deal with them anymore. And
Yeah.
the leaders that are going to make a strong impact on culture are those leaders that are willing to intervene and say, no, you're not going to do that. And also the leaders that are going to step up and say, I'm not going to push a problem employee off on somebody else. Either we're going to fix him or we're going to have to unfortunately let him go. And I think that those agencies, those law enforcement leaders that that capture that mindset or have that mindset, those are the ones that are really going to make an impact on the culture that we want to have.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because what you said is something that when I work with leaders, I tell them all the time. In the work of leadership, there is no such thing as neutral, right?
Yeah,
You are either contributing or you're detracting
Mhm.
yeah,
by what you say, by what you don't say, by what you do, by what you don't do, right? Everything you are doing or not doing is either moving the organization, creating the conditions that are going to create a climate of thriving
mm,
versus creating the conditions that create an environment where people have to survive your leadership. And what leaders don't often recognize is like there's a just a financial model to this. If we took values out of it, if we took emotional intelligence, all that stuff, right, all the soft stuff out, um, there are hard numbers that support intentional creation and cultivation of climate and culture in an organization. So you take, for example, the dollars it costs an agency to recruit, select, hire, train an officer, and get them to the point in their development, in their competency, where they can do the job, let's just say 80% to expectation, right? They can handle 80% of the work without support, coaching, etc. When you look at the dollars that represents, and then
mm,
you compare that to, we're going to put somebody in that FTO position that doesn't know how to create a safe environment to learn, that does not know how to coach and develop recruits. They see their job as only evaluative,
mm,
that has a belief about the FTO program that their job is to toughen people up so that they can handle the job. The impact of all of that, when you look at not only an individual's ability to learn, to retain information, to actually do the things you want them doing in the job, but also the hidden impact of their sense of belonging to the organization, their sense of engagement in the organization, their sense of safety in the organization. So, and you are literally taking all of that money that you invested to bring that person in and get them developed, and you are creating a set of conditions that impacts that person's performance, likely the rest of their career.
mm,
When I talk to leaders now about and I'm using FTO as an example, but when I talk to leaders, everyone remembers these stories in their FTO experience
That's true. Yeah.
that
yeah,
were traumatic, and they're still holding that,
Mm.
right? The
yeah,
impact of that to them. And so I think the mistake we make in this particular example, but it also it's transferable to other functions and situations in an organization is I go back to, the intentions are good, right? The FTO's intention of, I need to toughen this person up because the job is hard, right?
Right.
What we know about neuroscience and what we know about the biology, physiology of humans is resilience is not formed when we are in a constant state of hypervigilance. Resilience is developed when we are safe.
Right.
And so what we don't need is an organization that's operating under the same conditions that I might experience in the job. What I need is an organization that operates in the conditions that allow learning, right? That promote psychological safety, that allows vulnerability, et cetera, so that I have the capacity to go out into this job that is by its nature depleting. So
Right.
like I said, the intention is good, but the impact is not what in alignment with the intention.
Yeah. Wow.
Mm.
That's amazing stuff.
And and it happens at two levels. Individual leaders have to be able to create this environment of psychological safety. And that, in my opinion, is the foundation. You cannot be adaptable. You cannot be a learning organization. You cannot innovate. You cannot do any of those things that grow an organization if you don't have that fundamental ingredient
Mm.
of psychological safety. And it happens at the agency level. So, individual leaders have to understand this. And I talk about it in terms of emotional intelligence. And organizations have to operate in ways that are emotionally intelligent. And what that means is I can have a discipline process, you know, obviously a termination process, a promotion process, all of those things um, that are mechanisms to promote accountability, to ensure that, we're getting the performance, the behaviors that we're expecting. However, if we don't equally attend to how employees experience those processes, then they can be doing unintentional and very real long lasting harm. So
Right.
you Michael know already, like think about the promotion process just as an example. If I decide I want to promote, I take the test, I do all the things, and I don't get selected. That might be the right thing. Like from a process standpoint, maybe the
Right.
process actually selected the best person. So great. In that respect, the process worked. What we don't pay attention to, though, is the impact the experience of that process had on the people who didn't get promoted. So I'm
Right.
not suggesting that we have to make everybody feel good and everybody gets promoted. It's more in terms of like a human centric approach is hey, you went through the process, you didn't make it, and we still value you. We're going to give you the feedback we need. We still intend to invest in you, right? Helping build your leadership capabilities so that next time you have that. And most agencies don't do that. And so how much resentment have you experienced in your organization for
Mhm.
people who did not experience the promotional process in a way that felt like it was just?
Yeah.
Not in terms of outcome, but in terms of process and experience.
Yeah. It's interesting. Kathy and I were working with a police department that's really struggling with a retention problem. And I think about, what you're talking about goes like hand in glove with
For
retention,
sure.
right?
Mhm.
Because you're talking about that initial investment and what it takes to get them
Mhm.
to that 80%. And it doesn't take much if we're not intentional. It doesn't take much for us to cause that harm,
Yeah.
and them not feel like they're safe,
Mhm.
psychologically safe in
Mhm.
the culture within an organization. And if they're feeling that, um, in a way that they're not feeling safe, they're not
Mhm.
feeling cared for, they're going to be looking for another organization to go to
Or another
That
career.
or
yeah,
another career. Yeah,
Mhm.
that or they're gonna stay and
and be
all of
toxic.
their energy
Yeah, yeah.
is going to surviving. Because if the number one human need is belonging.
Mm,
So this is how maladaptive behavior gets developed because as humans, we so need to belong to the organization or to whatever the group, right? The family, whatever,
right.
that we will adapt, develop adaptations in our behavior to stay, to belong.
Mm,
And
mhm,
so the question leaders have to ask themselves is what are we asking people to belong to? Right?
right.
What do we want people to belong to? Because if that's clear and that's a guidepost for how we operate as leaders, then we have this it's sort of like the flywheel, right? You're working smarter, not harder, right? But like
Mhm,
you're creating this thing that lives outside of an individual leader that people want to be a part of, right? So they will be actively engaging in that. So the interesting thing about retention, and I talk to leaders about this all the time. So in the last many years, and I suspect this problem is not going away. I suspect it's going to get even more difficult is recruiting and retention. And
yeah.
I know organizations talk about that as kind of the same thing, right? We talk about recruiting and retention. We don't separate the two. And I do think um, law enforcement as a profession has made a lot of strides in the recruiting work. Um, where I think there's still opportunity is in how they think about retention.
Mm,
So the easy way or the most obvious way to think about retention is I look at an org chart and I see, hey, we have capacity for 700 officers. We only have 600. We're understaffed, right? And we can be looking at who's going to be retiring out. We look at most um, retention issues coming from retirements and that sort of thing. What leaders are not paying attention to? So they look at it as a staffing formula. We got to recruit this many more people, right, to fill the seats that are going to be coming available. So it's a simple math problem in terms of how
right.
we're looking at it now. Where we, I think, miss big opportunity is we don't look at of the seats that are filled in the organization, what percentage of those people are actively engaged in the organization. Gallup did a global survey, I think it was last year. So, not law enforcement specific, not
Mm,
specific to the United States, but a global workforce study that looked at workforce engagement. And the interesting thing about there's sort of three categories, right? A percentage of people are actively engaged. A percentage of people are actively disengaged. So
Mm.
they're like the loud quitters, right? They're the people who are like, yeah, I'm retiring in 2 years, 3 months, 7 days, 5 hours, and 26 minutes, right? And they're letting everybody know. And so they're having an impact in the environment, right? They're loud quitters. But then you have the larger part of the organization. And my recollection is it's in the around 62%, but don't quote me on that. It's in the 60%, 60th percentile of percentage of workers who are like quiet quitters.
Mhm.
And it's not they punch in, they show up, they do what's asked, so they're not like the problem employee. They're not the superstars. They may have been at some point. So this is
mm,
not a
Mm.
label that defines them as humans. We all at times go through being actively engaged, actively disengaged, kind of neutral. And so what I think leaders don't pay attention to is um the lost capacity of that 60 something percent of
Mm.
the workforce. And so retention is not just, oh, we're losing a person in that role. It also relates to how much of the capacity of the people you have is being given to the goals of the organization.
Mm.
And so it's a bigger problem than we're even recognizing and talking about in law enforcement right now.
Mm. Yeah.
Karen, I want to go back to psychological safety. And I think we could, again, this is something we could talk about for a very long time, but you work with agencies and leaders across the country. And there's always this tension in my mind between old school law enforcement, which is what Mike grew up in,
Mhm.
and then we've watched a really nice transition to getting better about taking care of your employees. And you don't have to just keep pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. And it's okay to feel things. And, there's help available. And we have peer support now. And we have mentors and all kinds of things that have changed for the better. But
Mhm.
in your work with leaders nationwide, how is the concept of psychological safety received? Are there those that are still pushing back on it and saying, "Oh, we just poo-pooing the idea?" Or do you feel like the majority of leaders are in tune with the needs of it and really wanting to adapt and embrace and make things better for future generations of law enforcement?
I think there's absolutely more acceptance and
I
acknowledgement
love that.
of the need.
Mhm.
Um, my experience is that the frontline leaders are particularly interested in adopting this model of leadership.
Mm.
So I'll talk about kind of both of those things. First of all, just kind of a funny story. So it was about, I want to say it's going on maybe almost 10 years ago now, when trust centered leadership was first developed. And that curriculum was originally called 21 CPI, 21st Century Police Leadership. It was developed in partnership with the Washington State Training Commission with a grant from Microsoft and the state of Washington. And so we went through, it was about an 18 to 24-month development process where we
Mm.
worked with a group of leaders from around the state of Washington, and we had west side of the state, east side of the state, urban leaders, rural leaders, all levels. So it was a very collaborative effort to really create something that did not exist in police leadership training for the state of Washington. And I remember this is one of my favorite stories about the development of that curriculum because we were piloting the emotional intelligence class. We had a leader a mid-level leader, second level leader in the pilot class. And I remember as I was facilitating, I'm talking about safe space. So this is kind of how we talked about psychological safety then,
Mhm.
creating safe space. And he had such a visceral reaction to the term safe space. And he told me afterwards, very respectfully, but just after the class, he says, you absolutely cannot say this to law enforcement. They will laugh you out of the room. So I said, well, let's help me. What should we call it? Right. Let's talk about what we should call it. So he said, well, let's talk about like comfort. And I said, well, we're not really talking, it's not comfort, right? It's not that. So we had this good conversation where I'm trying to get him to help me come up with another way to talk about it that might be more palatable to the audience. And bottom line is we couldn't, right? Because the concept of it is rooted in psychology, right? Rooted in neuroscience.
Mhm.
So we can't just like call it something else and people understand what it is.
Mm.
So I just decided then not to take that feedback, and I was like, we're just gonna plow ahead with this.
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
the, and the idea here being too that, and I think this is something for anyone in organizations that are trying to really move forward. It is an uncomfortable process in the beginning, right? The new thing is scary, right? It's
Mhm.
sometimes it's people aren't getting it. People, there's so much resistance. And that again is just the human process. Doesn't mean what you're doing is wrong, bad. But one thing we do often is we try to make everybody happy and comfortable. So we take what would have been an innovation and we ratchet it back so that everybody likes it and is comfortable. And then at the end of the day, we're not changing much. Right. So part of this whole idea of emotionally intelligent leadership, emotionally intelligent organizations, and adaptable organizations is getting comfortable with discomfort,
Mm.
Mm.
allowing space for discomfort, because that's where good things happen there. Right. And psychological safety allows that to happen, allows space for that. So that was just kind of a funny story about
Sure,
that. So,
sure.
so coming back to this idea, so here's how I talk about it with leaders. And it's all around officer health and wellness, but I've kind of shifted that to just employee health and wellness, right?
Mhm,
Everyone in the
mhm.
Mhm.
organization. And I think one thing law enforcement has done a wonderful job of in the most recent years is dealing with episodic stress.
Mm,
So that is, of course, directly for the people doing the work of policing. And it's, the officer involved shooting, the bad domestic violence call, any of those calls for service that we know have an impact on the
Mhm.
mental health of the first responders doing that work. And so, as you mentioned, there's peer support, there's, all kinds of health and wellness resources and programs. Many, many agencies have their own internal, like, divisions or groups that provide that. What we miss, or what we have, in my opinion, what we aren't paying equal attention to is the impact of chronic organizational stress. So episodic stress is something the public understands. Like
mhm,
that's a hard thing, right? So we can
mhm,
everybody can get behind resources for that, right? That is a no-brainer. The more common, frequent, constant source of stress in organizations, in policing organizations, is chronic organizational stress.
Yep.
That's like the death by a thousand paper cuts.
mhm,
Yep.
And so if you ask officers, what is the biggest source of stress in your work? They will say the administration. When you talk to sergeants, what do you see as the most important aspect of your role? I have to protect my people from the
Mhm.
administration. Now, that in and of itself is problematic. When you have an organization
Mm.
where one set of leaders believes their most important job is to protect their people from the other leaders in the organization,
Right.
That's a problem.
that's a problem.
Yeah.
So it sets up, by definition, it sets up this internal conflict, right? And that creates all this chronic organizational stress, right?
Mhm,
Them versus us, all that. So um the frontline leaders, because they see the day-to-day impact of
Mhm.
this chronic organizational stress, the way the organization operates. It's not as often what the organization does. It's not what the decision was. It's how they implemented it, how it
mhm,
got communicated or didn't get communicated, right? How people were asked for input or not asked for input. Like it's all that stuff. Um, because they see it and they feel it, they are very accepting of, first of all, they're able to acknowledge, yes, the climate in the environment is problematic. In some cases, more problematic than the work itself. So they recognize that. And so they're very open to this idea of emotional intelligence, of psychological safety, because they've been in the position to receive leadership, operate in an environment where it doesn't exist.
Yeah. That's great.
Karen, we're at the part of our show where we like to issue a challenge for our listeners. And I feel like today was a lot about awareness and maybe opening some eyes to perspectives that they may not have been aware of in the past. But if agencies wanted to start improving their culture, let's say even just if there's a sergeant listening or an FTO listening or an organizational leader listening, and they want to start making things better, what kind of places can they start to invest their leadership energy, even just this week, to start to turn the tables, even just a few degrees?
Yeah, good question. I would say for individual leaders, the heart of emotional intelligence, the starting point for emotional intelligence is self awareness.
Mm.
So there's this great quote I heard, Henry Kramer, I believe, who was a business leader, um, said, if I don't know myself, I can't lead myself. And if I can't lead myself, I can't lead others. And so the work for individual leaders is to go internal, right? Is
Yeah.
to become more aware of self. And I think the challenge is our rarely have I met a leader that has bad intentions.
Mm.
Nobody wakes up and says, you know, let me make everybody feel bad today, or, right? Or let
Yeah,
me it's
right.
not usually difficult, right? So there's no bad intention at all. Actually, intentions are good, and so part
Yeah.
part of
Yeah.
self-awareness is realizing the impact I'm having is not in alignment with my intention.
Hmm.
That's true for individual leaders, and that's true for the organization.
Mm.
So one person, he was at the time a sergeant who participated in the development of the Trust Centered Leadership Program, said it so simply yet so powerfully one day, where he said, in his mind, the way an agency operates, so say it's the way they announce a promotion decision or the way they engage in the discipline process, whatever it is, if they cared about me, is this how they would have done it? So the question is not, would they have done it? Because psychological safety and emotional intelligence absolutely do not remove accountability. Actually, what it does is it enhances accountability.
Right.
It holds leaders accountable for their role in whatever the outcome was, right? So it is the ultimate tool of self accountability.
Hmm.
So I think the challenge would be one thing I would start with is really paying attention. Pay attention for the next week about how the impact of your own leadership, what's happening in the organization, just notice it and really reflect on, if we cared, like we say we do, and I believe people do. This is
Uh-huh.
not a question of do they care.
Mhm.
It's a lack of awareness around the impact of how the organization is operating is having.
Mm.
That would be my challenge.
I love that. And this just came to mind. One thing that I learned long ago is that the two words if and since are interchangeable oftentimes. So it's not if I care about my people, it's since I care about my people,
I love
how
that.
how do I need to roll this out? How do I need to influence them? How do I need to do a better job as a leader and recognize that even my moods impact my team
Mm.
Absolutely. Oh, I
every
love
every
that.
single day? Good. Um, Karen, so much to talk about. We absolutely want to have you back, and I'm so glad that we've
Thank
already
you.
decided to do that. And I just want to say to our listeners that this wraps up just part one of this delightful conversation, very, very insightful conversation with Karen Collins Rice. And We hope that you will join us next time when we're going to take a little bit better look at emotional intelligence, what it is, why it matters, how it helps leaders. We're going to talk a little bit more about psychological safety to develop trust, strengthen culture, and lead organizations through change. And we invite you all back for part 2.
Thank you for having me.
We're so glad you're here.
Thanks, Karen.
If today's episode added value, don't let it end here.
Share it with someone on your command staff or leadership team, because strong leadership isn't built in isolation.
And if you're ready to develop or become proactive leaders inside your organization,
Leaders who communicate clearly and strengthen internal trust,
then visit leleaders.com to learn more about our coaching programs, workshops, and keynotes.
and if the podcast has been helpful, we'd appreciate your 5-star review on Apple Podcasts.
Until next time, lead with clarity, lead with conviction, and elevate your call to service.